Hi, I'm Sarah Gutterman. I am CEO of Green Builder Media, which is North America's leading media company focused on green building and sustainable living. And I'm so pleased to be here with you today to talk about zero carbon building and homes, because we're really in an incredible time right now in our economy, in the building industry, with respect to the fact that the discussion is decidedly shifting from net zero energy to net zero carbon. And along with that, there's a tremendous opportunity for innovation and for advanced thinking. And so in today's presentation, I am going to show you some of Green Builder Media's cognition smart data, market intelligence and insights that shows how and really why we are evolving from, again, that net zero energy conversation to this dialogue about net zero carbon and then what that entails. So let me dive into it. When we talk about net zero carbon, there's really three components, or let's say legs under the stool. The first has to do with sustainable design and construction. We have to address performance first through climate responsive design, building science best practices, and green building. Next, we have to specify low carbon products from low carbon companies. And then third, we really need to be using carbon offsets to kind of get us that last mile, so to speak, to abate and mitigate emissions that we can't solve for or that we can't eliminate or reduce through the first two elements. The reason why this is so urgently important for us to be discussing right now, every minute of every day, is this trifecta of an environmental, social, and financial reality. So from an environmental standpoint, I think we all know that we've hit 1.5 degrees warming in the last 12 months, and we're going to 2 degrees in the next 8 to 12 months. That's just the reality of what's happening in our climate. The next piece is the social reality. We're seeing that there are very high levels of climate anxiety, particularly within younger generations, so millennials and Gen Zs. Green Builder Media's Cognition Smart data shows that 3/4 of those younger generations consider the future to be frightening, and 56% think that humanity is doomed because of climate change. That's not 6% or 16%, that's over half. And these aren't just people that are worried about their future. They certainly are worried, but they really think that, they don't see a way out of climate change. And so it's really up to us to provide solutions and also to provide comfort to these younger generations so that they feel more hope for their future. And then, of course, we have the financial reality right now, whereby investors and lenders, even supply chain partners and municipalities believe that companies that have strong corporate sustainability and even environmental, social, and governance policies and practices are actually lower risk investment and partners because they are addressing the realities of a changing climate in order to reduce risk within their businesses, to shore up their supply chains, and to ensure access to the materials that they need to make their products, and then to transport and provide those products to the market. All of this is particularly important within the context of the built environment because of how conspicuously consumptive homes and buildings are. So these are some numbers by the Department of Energy. Homes and buildings in our country account for about 40% of our nation's total energy use, 70% of electricity use, and about 40% of total emissions. And while we have to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030 and 100% by 2050, if we even have a chance at staying under a 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise, not even 1% of our existing buildings here in the country and internationally are net zero carbon today. What we do know through Cognition Smart data is that consumers really believe that decarbonization strategies are helpful to business. They result in enhanced innovation, they generate positive brand equity, they yield greater financial returns, and they help to mitigate risk. So even though the concepts of climate change, decarbonization, environmental, social, and governance have become a bit politicized in today's environment, what we know is that there is that strong consumer demand and there is a very positive sentiment towards decarbonization. We also know that living in a net zero carbon home is becoming more and more important. And what we're seeing is that year over year, these numbers, as tracked by Cognition Smart data, are shifting from less important to more important, particularly within those younger generations, millennials and Gen Zs specifically. We also see that those younger generations are willing to invest more so than older generations and more so than what builders think that they will invest in sustainability upgrades like energy efficiency, electrification, healthy home, resiliency, water conservation, smart home, and solar plus storage. So the line on the right, the dark purple line, represents millennials and Gen Zs, and you can see that willingness is higher than when we group them with boomers and Xers, which is that middle blue line. The green line is the perception that builders have about what consumers will invest. And that's always a little bit lower. The way that we interpret that is that builders might have a little bit more of a realistic view about what consumers will spend versus what they say they will spend. But either way, we're just tweaking at the margins here because you can see for all of these sustainability upgrades, the percentage of willingness, whether it's perception by builders or the consumers responding themselves, it's over 50%. And in some cases for, say, energy efficiency, healthy home, solar plus storage, it's into the 70 and 80%. We're also seeing that there is mushrooming demand for sustainability products like energy efficient insulation, windows and doors, lighting, smart home systems and controls to improve performance and health and wellness, heat pump technology, solar plus storage. And again, all of these numbers continue to grow year over year. When we ask our builder audience how willing they are to embrace sustainability products, there's, again, a high and growing interest to adopt products like demand-side energy management systems, cool roof systems, high-performance building envelope systems, leak detection and water monitoring systems, etc. Now, this is a really interesting slide here. While we see that homeownership desire or the interest in owning a home is pretty consistent across the 4 generations that we track, boomers, Xers, millennials, and Gen Zs. We don't really track traditionalists, which are older than boomers, or alphas quite yet, which are younger than Zs because they don't really have an impact at this point on the housing market, although alphas certainly will fairly soon. What we see, though, is while that desire to own a home is consistent across those generations, the younger the generation, the more they have considered moving because of climate change, the more they are concerned about climate change impacting the value of their home. And then look at this bottom line. The more that they tell us that climate events are impacting their ability to get insurance for their home. Now, we all know that the insurance market for homes across the country is in shambles, from California to Florida, and many places in between, because of the increasing frequency and intensity of climate events, wildfires and drought in the western half of the state, superstorms and flooding, and tornadoes in the eastern half of the country. Excuse me, I said western half of the state. I meant western half of the country versus the eastern half of the country. We're kind of in a tale of 2 countries right now. However, the difference in the ability to get insurance for homes is so vastly different between boomers who, again, we interpret this as the fact that boomers are grandfathered in. They've been in their homes for a while. They're considered to be, fairly stable investments by the insurance companies, whereas younger buyers who may be first-time home buyers, maybe move-up home buyers, they're having a hard time, partly because they don't have the legacy that the older generations have, or the relationship with their insurance companies, so they're considered to be a higher risk. They're also moving into riskier secondary and tertiary markets. For example, along the Mountain West, or along what's called the WUI, the wildland urban interface, which is considered high risk by insurance companies because in that case, high wildfire risk. So there's definitely a big differential right now in terms of those younger generations versus older generations being able to access home insurance. The reason why this generational distinction is important to analyze and look at is millennials are now, they comprise over half of all home purchase applications. Those numbers are going to remain pretty steady for the next many years, in that low to mid 50%. But what we're seeing here is if you look at the red line, which is Gen X, and the yellow line, which are boomers, those lines are decreasing largely because those generations are in their forever homes. Whereas look at that little orange line. It's small right now, but it is going to rocket ship in the next several years. That's Gen Zs. And so we really see the impact of millennials and Gen Zs is already there, but it's going to continue to grow as Gen Zs continue to enter into the housing market. Now, let's get back to this concept of net zero carbon. And this is not just a phenomenon or a trend that's being pulled by consumer demand. It's also being pushed by a rapidly shifting regulatory landscape. So there are several examples, and I'll just cite a few. First and foremost, we're seeing that there are codes and regulations that are being put in place literally from California to Massachusetts that are starting to require scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting from builders and developers. So as an example, California passed 2 climate laws fairly in 2023 that are going to not only require companies that hit a threshold of $1 billion in revenue or over to report scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting, but that's also going to require builders and developers, more so of large commercial buildings at this point, but that will creep into residential as well, also provide climate reporting and carbon emissions reporting. The reason why that's important is particularly the companies that are required to report that are over $1 billion in revenue. The scope 3 reporting has to do with emissions from all of their vendors and all of their suppliers. So if you are a product supplier to one of their buildings or facilities, if you are a builder or a designer, if you're a banker, if you're a lender, if you're a lawyer, and you service or you provide services to those large companies, you're going to have to start providing reporting, climate reporting, emissions reporting to those larger companies. So these climate laws don't just impact those larger companies, but the whole ecosystem of companies and vendors and suppliers that support those companies. We also saw SEC approve scope 1 and 2 reporting for publicly traded companies. There's a question about whether or not those requirements are going to be implemented under the current administration. We're not quite sure either way. We do think that because the SEC has identified climate risk as an important factor to the health of publicly traded companies, that some version will be put in place, although it might not be the full scope of reporting. We also have seen a zero emissions building definition released by the Department of Energy. That's always a harbinger for things like ANSI standards and codes and regulations at a municipal and a state level. We saw the Biden administration come out with a set of voluntary carbon offset guidelines for carbon offset projects to put some guardrails around the definition of what a high quality science-backed carbon offset project looks like. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then, as I mentioned, those shifting codes and mandates, whether it's in California or Massachusetts, those are the two states that are most progressive right now with those mandates. But we can see in cities and states, literally from coast to coast, particularly those who have rigorous 2030 climate goals. Those states and cities are kind of waking up and saying, oh my gosh, it's 2025 and I've only made it this far towards my 2030 goal. Most of those states and cities are looking at efficiency and electrification from homes and buildings and communities and the implementation of renewable energy in order to hit those goals. So we're going to see a lot of changes in those codes and mandates in the next 5 years as those goals are being fulfilled. Simultaneously, as we see this shift in codes and regulations, we're also seeing a shift in the valuation metric. And this really started happening with millennials when they started entering into the housing market, even before COVID. They started thinking about full cost as opposed to just upfront cost. So they're not just looking at lowest price per square foot anymore. They're really looking at how much is it going to cost, not just to buy a home, but how much is it going to cost to live in that home? How much is it going to cost to operate and maintain that home in the face of rising energy bills, in the face of increasing climate events, and the need for more durability and resiliency. And so the valuation has decidedly shifted again from lowest upfront cost to full cost and full value of homeownership. And that was really augmented with the Biden administration through the Inflation Reduction Act incentives, whether that was 45L for builders who could access incentives for Energy Star and Zero Energy Ready homes. And that really shifted the game for many builders who realized that they could actually make money by building higher performance homes, as well as for the incentives offered to home owners and home buyers for energy efficiency and electrification upgrades. So as we continue this discussion about net zero carbon, I mentioned there's really 3 key steps to getting to a net zero carbon built environment. The first one is deploying sustainable design, building science, and green construction best practices. I won't go through all of these elements at greenbuildermedia.com. We've got free webinars and articles that go into all of these strategies, but really the leading practices that we see building professionals implement right now to get to net zero carbon construction have to do with passive heating, cooling, and ventilation strategies, of course, enhancing energy efficiency and thermal comfort, converting to all electric, designing for health and wellness, of course, solar plus storage, advanced technologies for control optimization, whether that's demand side energy management in conjunction with a utility to do things like peak load shifting and peak load shedding, which not only saves money for homeowners, but also reduces grid stress. And then looking at inspecting and testing and measuring performance throughout the build and operations. Really what this comes down to, though, is understanding the difference between embodied carbon and operational carbon. So the way I like to describe this, in case you're not familiar with these terms, is embodied carbon has to do with all of the carbon emissions up until the day a home is sold or really occupied. So from the first minute that the first raw material is extracted for the first product that goes into that home through to transportation, manufacturing, more transportation, delivery on the job site, waste management of packaging, and then construction and installation. Operational carbon starts occurring once that home or building is occupied. So any emissions that come from the operations of the home. If a home or a building has solar, that operational carbon is dramatically reduced. However, solar actually increases embodied carbon, but net emissions are reduced dramatically if you do have solar, so or any kind of renewable energy, really. So what we're seeing now is that builders, developers, even architects and designers are starting to think about product specification relative to embodied and operational carbon reductions. We're also starting to see, again, codes and regulations address these two things. Later this year, we'll see an ANSI standard 1550 be released. That's been created in conjunction with ResNet so that HERS raters can now go into a home and actually measure not just energy performance through a HERS rating, but now they'll also have a streamlined way through ANSI standard 1550 to measure embodied carbon, which is a great step forward in terms of just streamlining that measurement. The second step is the meticulous specification of low carbon products from low carbon companies. And this is hard because in the average American home, there's about 20,000 product inputs, about 450 SKUs or different types of products. And only a small portion of products on the market today are really considered to be low carbon. But with that said, that's changing. We're starting to see more and more companies provide environmental product declarations or EPDs for products, which is basically a document that relays the environmental performance and human health impact of a product over its lifetime. They're based on life cycle assessment. So there's some pretty rigorous science and analysis that goes into the creation of an EPD. I really recommend that any kind of builder or architect, designer, or product specifier looks for products with EPDs. They are becoming more and more available in categories, in a wide spectrum of categories. But they're very important if you're going to be designing and specifying products for reducing embodied and operational carbon. And then, of course, you can't have a low carbon product from a high carbon company in order to be authentic. So you also want to look for things like ESG reports, corporate sustainability reports, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions reports, climate risk disclosures. I've been talking about scope 1, 2, and 3, and for those of you who are not familiar with it, let me boil it down to this pretty simply. Scope 1 is direct emissions from anything that, let's say, is burned by a company. Scope 2 is emissions that is purchased or bought by a company, so purchased by a utility. And then scope 3 basically it consists of all other emissions associated with a company's activities. So as you can imagine, scope 3 can comprise 80 to 90% of emissions from a company. So it involves everything from vendors and suppliers, transportation, offices and facilities, waste management, actual use of the product, and then end of life considerations for products. So that's probably why the SEC did not include scope 3 in their requirements when they did make the final decision, because scope 3 is hard to measure. Now, any company that does business in Europe and has to report through the EU is already reporting scope 1, 2, and 3. And then again, those California climate laws are going to start requiring scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting. So we're going to start moving more and more towards understanding the full life cycle analysis of emissions for companies and products. So we're moving in that direction. I don't think we're moving fast enough, but certainly the train has left the station. Now, ESG has become a dirty word in certain circles. And at the end of the day, whether we call it environmental, social, and governance, or whether we call it corporate sustainability, or whether we just call it risk management, what we do know is that consumers really believe in ESG. As you can see here, let's say 75% of our consumers that we survey through Cognition Smart Data are very likely or somewhat likely to choose a product from a company with a strong ESG strategy over one without. You can see that nearly 60% believe that companies with strong ESG strategies are more likely to have financial success than those without. Nearly 75% of our consumer audience have stopped purchasing products because of concerns over their ESG or corporate sustainability practices. And this chart on the right is interesting because you can see over half of our audience believe that the quality of a company's products and services has directly to do with their corporate sustainability practices. So that's interesting because whether it's true or not, that is the perception. And again, it's really because these younger generations, they have been affected by climate change. They feel guilty about their negative impact on the environment. They believe that they have to step up to make a difference in the world, but they also really believe that companies are an essential part of the solution, and they want to be engaged with those companies to develop better climate solutions. 82% of millennials and Gen Zs say that the more socially and environmentally responsible a company is, the more motivated and loyal that they will be as employees and customers. But here's the rub. We are actually at historically low levels of consumer trust. And you can see here that nearly 70% of millennials in particular think that companies greenwash very often. So there's kind of this chasm between the need to tout corporate sustainability and the trust levels in the market. So we always advocate to the companies that we work with that it's really time to ask very hard questions if you're not already. Not just about what can you produce that will make money, but what can you produce that people actually want and what the world needs? What can you offer that actually provides a real solution to the challenges that we exist today? And that's a really different type of thinking, right? There's this shift from a model where we exploit nature and people and the environment to extract value and make profit, to one that actually creates value and enriches the lives of the shareholders and the environment through collaboration, through wider representation, and certainly through emissions reductions. Now, I mentioned environmental product declarations, and I just want to show a couple of slides with data about EPDs. Our builder audience, about 85% are already specifying products with environmental product declarations. For the, let's say 15% that aren't, you can see that, almost all of them will start specifying products with EPDs in the next year or couple of years. So clearly we're going in that direction. And then when we ask our builder audience to prioritize EPDs over other certifications and labels like Energy Star, WaterSense, Indoor Air Plus, about a little over 45% say that EPDs are on par with other certifications. About 25% say that EPDs are their top priority. And this is important because when we started asking about EPDs maybe 5 years ago, these numbers were 0 to 8%. And so they're really shooting up. And just the fact that EPDs are on par with things like Energy Star shows their growing level of importance. And then about 65% say that their home buyers are familiar with EPDs. And then about 20% say that while their consumers might not be familiar specifically with EPDs, they're asking for product certifications to verify sustainability claims. Now, the last piece in this puzzle or the equation for getting to a net zero carbon built environment includes carbon offsets. And carbon offsets have had a little bit of a bad rap over the last many years because there's a big chasm between high quality and low quality carbon offset projects. And there have been some very bad actors who have, for example, planted a tree and then sold that tree 1,000 times. And that's called double accounting. And if you're not familiar with the concept of a carbon offset, basically one carbon offset is the equivalent of removing or preventing 1 ton of carbon from either being in the air or entering the atmosphere. And there's a lot of different kinds of carbon offset projects. Some are nature-based, so tree replanting, mangrove planting. Mangroves are actually particularly effective in sequestering carbon. And then there are also nature-based projects. So direct air capture projects, you may have heard of some of these where they take fans and they literally suck carbon out of the air and store it into the ground, into limestone or other material. There's biochar projects that take agricultural waste and turn it into biochar and store that, and other kinds of technology projects, like landfill gas capture or abandoned oil and gas well capping to prevent those abandoned wells from leaking carbon into the air. There's a very big difference, as I mentioned, between high and low quality carbon offset projects. A high quality offset project addresses additionality, meaning it's not a project that would have been completed anyway. It provides robust and comprehensive reporting and analytics. It does not double account, like I just talked about, where it sells one tree and it plants one tree and it sells that tree one time and then it retires that offset, so that gets taken off the market, which also ensures permanence. But also the permanence of carbon removal means, and this is harder with tree planting, because if you plant a tree and then the tree dies, those emissions, some of the emissions get released back into the atmosphere. But then there's also third-party validation and certification, and just very well-defined pricing, benefits, and results. Green Builder Media, this is not a sales pitch, this is just a point of reference. We actually are now providing carbon offsets. We've partnered with a company called CNOT to create portfolios of only high quality science-backed projects. And this is really because we wanted to get rid of the bad actors from the availability to our network of companies and builders. But we really, really believe, whether you purchase them from us or somewhere else, because there are a lot of other places to purchase carbon offsets from, if we look realistically at where we are in the market right now, we just don't have enough green design and building practices or green low carbon products to get to a fully net zero carbon built environment. So we have to address that. Again, I called this the last mile earlier, and that's really what we believe. You can get pretty far addressing performance and specifying low carbon products, but there's still going to be some rogue remaining embodied and operational carbon emissions. And so please look at purchasing carbon offsets somewhere, because we've got to, again, abate. We can't just ignore those emissions, because while they may be small, relatively speaking, if you look at, and when we add them up project by project, building by building, community by community, it ends up being a colossal number and really important in solving for getting to a net zero built environment. So I hope that some of the information that I provided today was helpful and useful. You have my email here, so feel free to shoot me a note if you have any questions. And thank you again so much to Aaron Rice and all of his colleagues for having me on your program today.
Sarah, this was awesome. Thank you so much. Wow, loads of information. So I do have a few questions. Do you have a few minutes?
Sure.
Okay. So the construction industry is kind of notoriously known to be, unfortunately, the least digitized, declining in productivity, and has a strong resistance to change. Um, what made you want to focus on that sector for everything that you're talking about when it comes to sustainability, greenhouse gas reduction, carbon reduction? It seems like that would be maybe the toughest market to address, but the one that has the most need. Why did you choose to go in that
Yeah.
direction?
Aaron, thank you. That's a great question. And I've seen those statistics that you're probably citing, where I think the building and construction industry is kind of second to last, just over hunting and fishing in
Yeah,
terms of
The McKenzie study,
digitization.
right? Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So my background, I was in venture capital before I co-founded Green Builder Media, and I worked with a mid-sized fund in Boulder, Colorado, and we invested mostly in, and this was in the 90s and early 2000s. We invested mostly in telecom infrastructure at that time and biotech, but because we were in Boulder, we got to invest in some organic foods and natural retail companies like Horizon Organic Dairy and the Whole Foods of Europe, which we sold to Whole Foods. And so I got to learn from some people far smarter than me about creating companies that were simultaneously sustainable and profitable. And even back then, I came to understand the urgency of our climate issues, really before it was kind of mainstream, and really when it was pretty hard to talk about it. You were considered kind of fringe. In 2004, I met my co-founder of Green Builder Media, a gentleman named Ron Jones, who is considered to be one of, and there are many, but one of kind of the fathers of the green building movement here. He's been a green builder for about 45 years
Wow.
here in the US, and very instrumental within and beyond the industry. And so in 2005, we decided that there was a white space to really streamline the language of sustainability in the building sector. So we combined his experience in the building industry, because he had already won pretty much every award, building award, and building award period, that you could win, and then the experience that I had in starting and growing companies. And that was 20 years ago. This year is our 20th anniversary. And I won't take you through the long and circuitous journey of starting something out of nothing, because that's hard to do. But what I will tell you is that uh, the hill used to be a lot steeper and the boulder used to be a lot bigger. And now there's still a hill and there's still a boulder, but it's less steep and a much smaller boulder. And I think that, back then because the goal was to streamline the language of sustainability, as I said, and make it so that it wasn't scary and it wasn't fringe, but it was talked about. So back then we could talk about energy efficiency, building science, and cost savings from energy efficiency and building science. Today, of course, our discussion is much more robust and deep, and we get to talk about full-scale decarbonization and really innovative products and technologies and systems and climate responsive design. But I think that just being really determined and stubborn is was the key to success.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, let me take it back to where you first started your presentation. I think you kind of did a comparison between net zero energy and net zero carbon. Net zero energy homes is a term that, zero energy ready. Like that's a term that's commonly used in the industry, but not so much net zero carbon when it comes to new homes. Can you kind of go back and maybe break down the difference between the two, how you see it?
Sure. So there's actually three terms in there. There's zero energy ready, and that
Mhm.
is actually a, Department of Energy certification that indicates that a home has hit certain performance levels. It's Energy Star. It uses WaterSense guidelines. It also incorporates Indoor Air Plus, which is another EPA certification. And it is basically wired and has all of the elements necessary to install solar and storage, basically, or renewable energy systems.
It's EV
So,
ready as well, right?
sorry?
It's EV ready?
EV ready, absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
Mhm.
So that's zero energy ready. Net zero energy means that a home or a building is producing as much energy as it utilizes. And oftentimes, when a home or a building is zero energy, excuse me, is net zero energy. It has, most often in today's market, solar plus storage, as well as advanced electrical panels, smart electrical panels from companies like Span or Schneider Electric. A lot of times it'll have demand side energy management where it interacts with a utility to do things like I mentioned earlier, like peak load shifting, peak load shedding, and then just energy optimization. So maybe the system can do things like preheat or pre-cool spaces during off-peak hours to reduce energy load and demand, and to save money. Net zero carbon is a different discussion entirely, that really does involve looking at the carbon emissions from the construction and the ongoing operations, and ultimately the end of life considerations for a
Mhm.
home or a building. So again, it involves that embodied carbon, which is pretty comprehensive. It includes all of the materials used, transportation, packaging, waste management, installation, and construction practices. And then operational carbon is the ongoing operations and use of that home and building. So looking at emissions from operations. There are several ways to measure embodied and operational carbon at this point. There are calculators, one that is preferred by a lot of the folks that I work with is called Beam. There's One Click LCA. There's a variety of tools and calculators to measure embodied and operational carbon. There are also groups of professionals that now provide life cycle assessments for homes and buildings and can measure carbon emissions. And then, as I mentioned, that ANSI standard 1550, which will specifically be for residential units, homes and multifamily, uh, that will help streamline the measurement of embodied carbon. It is not completely comprehensive. There will be iterations, but it's a good start. We've got to start somewhere. And there's a lot of
Sure.
considerations when you look at measuring embodied carbon, as you can imagine.
Sure. Absolutely. No, I appreciate that. And I love the statement about just kind of doing the calculations and what consumers are doing and what some builders are doing. And it sounds like kind of what you're recommending as well is really evaluating the total cost of new home ownership versus an existing home, which is a lot more expensive to retrofit than kind of building it in to a new home. What would you say is kind of maybe the biggest barrier to adoption that you're finding out there in the field when you're talking to some builders who may have, been very comfortable doing things the way it's always been done with limited disruption other than COVID? But maybe post-COVID, what would you say are some of the barriers to adoption, or at least one of the biggest barriers to adoption to this type of work that you're talking about?
Sure, there's a few. First and foremost is just education and awareness. I think that when we are able to educate builders and contractors about, for example, heat pump technologies for heating and cooling systems and water heating, even induction cooktops and heat pump dryers, those types of energy efficient and electrification technologies beyond the energy efficiency upgrades like insulation and better doors and windows. I think a lot of builders understand that concept, but some of these new technologies, when builders listen and they're able to actually learn, they understand that they can actually get incentives themselves or help their home buyers or even homeowners, if it is a retrofit, access incentives to help reduce the cost. And then when you do the numbers, the payback period becomes pretty short. So
Mhm.
energy efficiency and even electrification in many markets is becoming very transactional. Here are
Mhm.
the numbers, here's the payback period. After a year, 2 or 3, or whatever that number is, you're actually making money, right? You're saving money, but you're also making money. And so now that some of those things have become very transactional, when we're able to talk with builders and they're willing to listen, let's say,
Mhm.
it becomes a much easier conversation, and it really eliminates what has historically been the highest barrier to adoption, which is just getting stuck in old ways and not willing to learn and evolve. Now, the problem there is that even if the builder is willing to adopt new technologies, in some cases, we're finding that it's the contractors then
Mm.
who are like, no, I don't install heat pumps. I don't know what those are. I'm not going to, get out of my comfort zone. And so the builders are struggling finding qualified and skilled contractors to do the installations in some cases. The other barrier has historically been cost. But again, I think that barrier is also being eliminated very quickly, partly because of price parity. So the cost of these more advanced technologies is coming down dramatically as demand increases. And so the prices are more on par with conventional products and systems. But then also when you add the incentives on, again, the enabling more sustainable uh, technologies become much more desirable, and it kind of gets rid of that obstacle.
Mhm.
And then I think just the last barrier I would say is um, in certain markets, there's just a general wariness of new things, and I think that's going away too. And again, partly driven by younger generations who are very tech focused. So for them, having a high performance, connected, and intelligent and healthy home is now just becoming a baseline.
Great.
And I didn't put this slide into this presentation, but we recently did a survey, and it was the first time ever since we've been asking this question, which has been, maybe a decade. We asked all four generations, boomers, Xers, millennials, and Gen Zs, if they prioritize lowest upfront cost or that full cost of home ownership when they're buying homes. And all four generations, for the first time ever, said that they are now prioritizing that full cost of homeownership.
Mhm.
It used to be, as I said, it was first millennials,
Mhm.
then it was millennials and boomers, actually. And now Xers and Gen Zs are on the bandwagon as well.
I love it. I love it. Wow. So much information. I've got loads more questions, but we just unfortunately don't have more time. But I'm a loyal subscriber to Green Builder Media, and I love getting my constant daily, every other day articles that are very engaging. If anybody's watching this and not plugged into Green Builder Media, where do they go to subscribe?
Yes, greenbuildermedia.com. You can subscribe to our Vantage weekly e-newsletter. It's kind of our best of roundup e-newsletter. Comes out on Thursdays. It's free. And then you can also subscribe to our magazine, Green Builder Magazine. We do have a print version. We use recycled paper, and we buy carbon offsets, and we plant trees to offset emissions from having a print magazine. I just want to be clear about that. It's the most, kind of highly emitting and consumptive thing that we do as a business. But we try to mitigate that. But the digital version of the magazine is free, so you can look at that online and just scroll through the flip book.
Sarah Getterman, thank you so much for your time, your thought leadership, your subject matter expertise. This is perfect. This is just what we're looking for. And I appreciate you doing this. Thank you so much.
I appreciate you, Aaron. Thank you so much for having me, and it's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Have a great day.